Welcome to this webinar of BCS London West branch. I'm Ram Kundanani. I'm treasurer and committee member of the branch. We have two distinguished speakers today, namely Kevin and Robert. They have distinguished expertise in the area of AI and ethics. We will learn more from them without talking much about them. I would like to hand over the platform to Kevin now, so that we can make maximum out of the available time. Over to you, Kevin.
Thank you, Ram. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks to all of the BCS members for joining today and for inviting us to talk. It's a pleasure to join you guys once again. So I'm Kevin Butler, and I'm the founder and CEO of Centigy. Centigy is essentially a services provider, and we specialize in conformity assessments for AI HR technology. And I'm joined today by Dr. Robert Elliott Smith, who is very modest, by the way. He'll introduce himself in a moment. But, he's been involved in AI for over 30 years. And when he's not building models for NASA, he's tearing his guitars apart in his workshop and rebuilding them from scratch. So he has certainly got an engineer's mind. Robert?
Yeah, as Kevin said, I've been working in AI for about 30 years. I'm an engineer by training, but have been working in that area for many years, largely in the aerospace and defense industry. I'm a research fellow at University College London as a part-time job. I'm an entrepreneur. I advise some businesses, and I've been working with Kevin for a while on Centigy, and you're going to hear a lot more about our thoughts now.
All right, so I'll just share my screen now, and we will start the presentation. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is just at a high level. I'll tell you a little bit about Centigy. We won't spend too long on that. We're going to really get into the bulk of the presentation, and that's around ethical AI in action. Or really, we're going to start with unethical AI in action before we get to the ethical stuff. And there's some change on the horizon. So there's some proposed regulation that was released about 3 weeks ago now from the EU, and there's also some movement over in the States as well, in New York, with some regulation for AI. So we're gonna take you through what that means, tech vendors, to us, to everybody that's involved that touches AI technology, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end. And for that Q&A session, give us your best questions. Dr. Robert Elliott Smith wrote this book, which is called Rage Inside the Machine, and it was nominated for Best Business Book of 2020. I'd recommend it to anyone who's involved or interested in AI to pick it up, or just send us a good question. You might be able to win a copy. So Centigy, as I said, we essentially, we specialize in conformity assessments, and conformity assessments are going to be very, very important in the future for AI technology, because it'll form part of the regulation. Certain types of AI that's deemed high risk will have to conform to the ethical standards set for each member state or union, if it's for the EU. And in fact, what the EU is proposing is it's more of a global standard. So that's essentially what all AI HR tech will have to comply with, and not just in the HR realm as well. We'll talk about some of the others later. But Centigy in the news. So last month we were in Forbes. We're very happy about that. We launched our conformity assessment services in April. They've been in development for over a year. And then more recently, last week, Newsweek ran a story on us. That's us on the top left there, that featured story, struggling to get a job. Artificial intelligence could be the reason why. So we're being picked up by a lot of news outlets now. We're gathering a little bit of steam. So now we're going to talk about when AI goes wrong. And I know Robert loves to tell these stories. He's got way more than we could ever put into a slide deck and fit into 20 minutes. But we'll take you through some of the stories that you might be familiar with, and others that you may not have heard of. And it's really all about bias and how bias creeps into a system and how it can affect people. I'll just start with the first one, Robin, and you take it after this. So there's been many different news articles about what has happened with Uber. Uber's drivers have been suspended because its ID facial recognition tool couldn't recognize certain faces. It could be due to the color of their skin, or in one instance, it was for an individual who was a trans, and it couldn't recognize that person, right? It was difficult to run the check, didn't recognize the person, so they couldn't work. So you look at who is actually affected by this, right? Who really felt this? And obviously the drivers, of course, I mean, they couldn't work for a couple of weeks, perhaps. Some of them completely lost their jobs there. And then you've got, of course, Uber, right? Who selected this piece of technology, and they wanted it to be just an efficient way for you to validate that you are actually the driver, right? And you can get to work without having to complete lots of forms and everything else. So they got in a bit of hot water over this because, of course, it looked like they weren't really looking out for minorities. And they didn't have a remedy in place in case people were affected by this. And then you've got the tech vendor who developed this piece of technology. And of course, all right, they're also to blame. Nobody wins in this situation. And all they needed was a remedy. If your face is not recognized, press this button, call this person. You can scan your passport and send it to this email address. Something, rather than, we don't recognize you can't work today. Rob?
Yeah, I'll jump in on this one. A few years ago, AI had to scrap Amazon had to scrap an algorithm because it taught itself that male candidates were preferable. This is the way it was reported in Reuters. What the interesting thing about it is that it didn't do that by looking at males per se. What it did was it was looking at industry experience, and because of the prominence of tech industry experience in male resumes, it was therefore proxying for males as being preferable. And this indicates something of the subtlety of the problem. This is a very, very relatively simple form of proxy bias, but there are much more complex and much less tractable forms of proxy bias that can turn up as well. There's some really nice articles on this. If you give me the next one, Kevin. And this article is reported in The Guardian just a few years ago, is that if you looked at Google's preference for showing job ads, it generally showed more prestigious job ads to men than to women. And this was a well-documented phenomenon from a few years ago, which probably, although we don't know the sources of it, is probably in the proxy bias case. Yeah, give me the next one, Kevin. And then this one, this is a very famous set of things. We've concentrated a lot on facial recognition here, but it's certainly not the only potential problem. But facial recognition's use in HR technology has been fairly prominently criticized. There are plenty of instances where facial recognition has failed to see dark-skinned people, it's misgendered others, it's excluded women. The tendency for it to intersectionalize that has been well documented as well. Is that dark-skinned women in particular have been shown by many of the commercial systems available to be gendered as men by the system. And then there's the very interesting couple of cases some of you may have heard of. If any of you have applied for a passport in any time in the recent years online, I've done it myself. The photos are checked by an algorithm that effectively tries to see if it's compliant with a few rules, including you can't wear glasses, you have to have your eyes open, and you can't open your mouth, and you shouldn't smile. Strangely enough, is one of the rules. And here in the UK, there was a famous incident a few years ago where a gentleman of African descent could not submit his photo because he has thick lips. This is the guy, actually. This is exactly the photo. And those of you who understand image recognition algorithms a bit will realize what's going on here is that it thinks his mouth is open because it is mistaking his lips for his tongue. That's that's a supposition on my part, but I'm pretty sure that's what's going on. And I was giving a talk about my book in Australia, and someone said, "Oh, we had the same problem here. It was in the news, but it was with an Asian gentleman who the algorithm was saying that his eyes were closed." So I think the interesting things about a lot of these cases, in particular those that really illustrate the cases, sometimes it seems that the biases of algorithms align with typical things that people who are racist might think. Why is that? The real reason there, it's another form of proxying in the sense that these algorithms have probably been trained primarily to recognize white faces because in those countries, the majority of people were from that race, and therefore its feature recognition is very bad in certain variations of human faces, therefore implicitly making it have biasing effects against those people. A couple of things about that. One thing about it is that why eyes for Asians and lips for Black people? Well, the question is, why were those things used as the things people talk about who are prejudiced? Is because they're prominent and recognizable features, yet they're not recognized by algorithms because of this bias effect. And the second thing about those that's really important is in the passport algorithm, if there was just a way to escape and say, I need to talk to a human being, this wouldn't have been a problem. But unfortunately, if you've ever used the online tool for the passport, you'll find out that there's no escape. You have to follow what the algorithm says, and there's no way to get out and speak to a human. So I'll let it go on for there, Kevin. I'll hand it back to you.
But I think on this, and this is just facial recognition, right? So that should be the easiest, like in comparison to emotional detection, which there's plenty of emotional detection AI systems out there. So if we can't even get a static face right, how are we expected to be able to categorize every kind of human emotion for every type of background and, feeling that an individual has at that point in time?
Sure, and I'll just add in is you get different kinds of biasing effects in different kinds of modalities. In the emotion recognition, you have to, first of all, there's cultural variation, and second of all, there's neurodiversity, that people express emotions differently depending on who they are, so that these things are fraught with problems from different perspectives depending on what you're using. By the way, the emotion detection, just like facial recognition, has played a role in HR software as well.
And another story.
This is a classic funny one. There's a great video of this. It's funny and it's not funny, but there's a great video of this on YouTube of the hand dispenser that won't recognize dark skin. And the funny thing is if the guy eventually picks up a piece of paper and holds it underneath it, then it can see that. So it's just the sensor. You think these things would be thought through, but sometimes they're not. That one's probably not something you're going to see used in HR, but it does show how deeply penetrative treating the majority rather than the broad range of humanity can be in people's day-to-day lives.
How do you think this happened? You think it was a small development team and they just tested it on their own hands and it worked for them, so that was it?
Well, a little known fact that I think is not unrelated to this is that if you go back and look at early cameras that do automatic brightness adjustment, they're utterly terrible on anything but white people. And the reason is the algorithms for sensors sometimes are calibrated to do certain things, and those things are based around the majority. Now, this sensor is calibrated wrong. Whether that was the effect of possibly if this was a light detection sensor and it was calibrated for general use in detecting people's skin, it may have been set with those settings that you see in a lot of old cameras.
Interesting. So we're we've got a couple of burning questions, which was on the invite that we're going to go through now. And we're going to help you to be able to answer. So how can we tell? This is a question that we get a lot at Entity, right? How can we tell good AI from bad when there's thousands of different applications out there? How do we know is this actually ethical or not? Is it going to have a good outcome or not? What do you think, Rob? What's the easy answer to this?
An easy answer is hard, but I think the answer to this is it's ultimately about effects. Yeah.
Yeah. So what's the outcome? Who's been
Who's affected? Yeah.
Negatively affected or not?
Yeah. And yes, I know where you're going with this, but I'll let you get there.
All right. So so what happens then in these circumstances? When biased AI makes decisions that negatively affect people and organizations. I suppose you could look at the Uber example. There were a lot of individuals and organizations, and even I suppose the regulators for Uber would have been involved in that as well. The brand was damaged, people's livelihoods were damaged, and I think other than a few journalists probably getting a few clicks, most people lost out in that circumstance. What do you think, Rob?
Yeah, and those are examples where let me give you an example that's of AI doing a bad job in HR. Is one of the things that is done a great deal now in hiring sites is that resumes are automatically processed. And there's an attempt made to basically pull out characteristics of job candidates, unusually arranged or resumes that have timelines that don't fit the standard or talk about something in a strange way that can just simply be disregarded. So the impact can be effectively not only one of these cases that appears in the news, but simply not being able to find the right candidate because you're throwing out people for reasons that are just more about format than about content.
Yeah, and so you're ranking people essentially, and the system says, well, to the recruiter, just talk to this top 25% because they're the best, and everybody else is affected unknowingly. You don't know that you didn't get the job because the AI made that decision. Now, what question should we be asking to test if AI will support diversity?
Well, and the good question is, what do we mean by diversity? We have diversity has become a code word for certain well-identified, intolerances, sexism, racism, prejudice against people with different orientations, etc. However, diversity has a broader meaning in HR in the sense of promoting a diverse team, a diverse set of thought patterns, a diverse set of contributions. And, what questions should we be asking to basically support that larger issue of diversity?
And I suppose then leads us on to, who's responsible here for ensuring that AI is used ethically, right? And there's many different players in this. Is it the state, to set the rules that, they already set for us? Should they set more rules essentially that we'll get something out of? Because that's why we follow the law right now. Should there be more laws? Is it the developers, the individuals? Should they be following an ethical standard, a framework for safe technology? The vendors who employ developers, the users, business leaders who adopt the technology, or it's a bit of everyone, isn't it?
And it's interesting how the ecosystem is evolving around those responsibilities. But certainly all the individuals involved need to be well informed so that they can make good decisions about how to make these algorithms perform in a way that's most effective for everyone.
Absolutely. And to even go back, there's a couple of questions there or around diversity on that third question. I was just thinking, like in HR tech, I've seen these AI proactive sourcing tools. And some of them are absolutely fantastic. They're a very powerful tool for a recruiter to find the individual that's the right fit for that role. Okay. Now, what a lot of them are using it for right now, using proactive sourcing tools right now, is to improve diversity in organizations.
You may have to explain proactive sourcing for this audience, Kevin.
Okay, so proactive sourcing is, I want to find candidates that are suitable for a role, right? And I will then enter in the criteria for this individual, right? So, and it could be that they need to have 10 years experience in this role. They need to have higher education. They need to live in a certain area. They need to have ability to travel, willingness to travel, can work from home, all of that, right? So you go through a whole kind of checklist of what a good candidate or employee will look like. And then you use one of these proactive sourcing tools, which then scans the market. It basically trawls LinkedIn and sites like that. And then it will basically send you a report of, here is all of the talent that's available that fits your description. And what a lot of recruiters are using these tools for now is to improve diversity, right? So for instance, I want to hire more neurodiverse individuals in Manchester, in a manufacturing site there, or I want to improve gender diversity, or we want more representation from minorities. So that's more criteria that you add into your proactive sourcing tool, and you're able to improve that. Now, that's, I would argue, being used for good, right? So these very powerful tools can be used for good. But, much like a scalpel in the right hands of a surgeon's hands can be used to save lives, in the wrong hands, it could cause serious harm. And of course, these tools that I'm talking about, a proactive sourcing tool, you may only want to hire 40-year-old white men. And that tool will enable you to do that. So it can do in either way. So really, I think a lot of the responsibility here, obviously it falls with the developers of the tool, but in educating the users on its fair usage. Because I think we will get to a point where these tools will all fit into a framework, an ethical framework. They'll all be certified. Everything on the market will be certified, but it'll be up to us that's using the tools to use them correctly. So speaking of certified tools, there's some change on the horizon, right? It's moving at a fairly lightning pace right now. There's new regulation being proposed by the EU. There's also some regulation being proposed in the US. There's a New York bill, but we're just going to talk about the EU today. And what's actually being proposed.
And if I can add in here, the way the regulations are proposed is they're about selling within the European market. So effectively, this affects vendors all over the world if they want to sell in the EU. So although it's a proposal from the EU, it affects the largest market, largest single market in the world, and therefore really affects everybody.
So would you say much like GDPR?
Very much like GDPR. I would say that's a precise analogy. And if you want that first bullet there, Kevin, the definition of AI being very broad, I could certainly address that now if you'd like me to.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, so here's the thing, and you'll miss this. If you read the regulations, you'll miss it because it's in the first appendix. It's not in the beginning. It's 108 page of regulations in the main document. And then there's an appendix. And the first thing in the appendix you won't get to unless you look very carefully. It's not mentioned until later on, and that's the definition of what they mean by AI. And it's a pretty short document, but it's easily relatable. Is on the one hand, it's anything that is machine learning. So that's bullet one, is anything that learns from data. And then the second one is anything that uses inductive or deductive logic. So those of you who are computer guys will sort of realize that's all of computing. Effectively, once you've said, anything that uses deductive logic, anything that basically follows, then from the purpose for the purposes of someone litigating within that rule, it'll be very difficult to separate AI from all of computing under the guidelines. So it's kind of important to know these are ultra broad as written. Yeah, I'll let you go.
And I think it's probably in appendix because they're expected it to change. And they've already taken a lot of feedback on the definition of AI. But essentially, it's right. Their position is any technology that negatively affects your fundamental rights will need to be monitored and certified, and some of it will be prohibited. So this is a key.
And they. Yeah, sorry, Kevin.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Those of you who have been around for a while and seen AI develop will know that definition of AI question is a bit of a maw to stick your hand into. And I think that they'll be kicking around the definition of AI for quite some time. But I imagine that it's going to err on the side of broadness rather than the side of a narrow specific definition, because what Kevin says is true, is that they're trying to basically they're focused on impact of computing systems. That's what they're really focused on, as opposed to being focused on particulars of an academic argument about what AI is.
It'll be interesting to see how it develops. But if I was to just even look at use cases in HR technology, which is all I really know, right? So these are the stories I have. So there's a lot of HR tech that's not AI, right? But it still grades people. It still will rank individuals, candidates, in order of whatever you have selected it to do. So under its definition now, and that, so by the way, that can affect your fundamental rights. That can affect your right to your career prospects. So I think it being broad is helpful. So as we said, it's a global proposal, much like GDPR, stuff that's prohibited. So there's not that much on there, but there's 4 pretty big ones. So anything that violates your right or dignity and non-discrimination, and that's really kind of covers whole groups of people, to group a whole a minority and grade them versus others. So that's completely prohibited.
And one comment I want to make about that one is that, of course, that will be that's like a fundamental human rights declaration. That will be the subject of interpretation for many years. That particular one.
Absolutely. And social scoring and ways to measure trustworthiness. I haven't really seen much of that in Europe.
And obviously what that is in reaction to is the social scoring system in China that some of you will know about. Is that there's essentially a big data based social scoring system in China that is being used to determine access to high quality goods, travel. It basically offers you social perks if you have a high score from this analysis, and they're obviously saying they're not going to do that in Europe. So it's obviously based on that one.
Good. Subliminal techniques to distort behavior. I think this is an interesting one. Of course, it's off the back of some of the manipulation in democracy, in particular. Maybe the Cambridge Analytica would be outlawed.
Yeah, exactly. Micro-targeting applications and things like that probably would fall under this, but it's also a terribly broad one, number 3.
It's quite broad. And then real-time biometric identification in public places. So biometric identification is fine.
Sorry, Kevin, I'm working on you. You got it.
That's all right. So biometric identification is fine. That's high risk, but real-time in a public place is not, unless you're trying to find an individual. Rob?
Yeah, and I think this one's terribly interesting. What they've done is they basically made it about reactivity in some sense. If it's real time, then it falls under the prohibited category. You'll see later that also comes into the high risk category if it's not real time. But they have put in the out clause which is basically if you're trying to find a terrorist or someone who's an immediate threat. So there is an out clause there for the kind of things you'd think there'd be an out clause for.
And now we'll move on to the high risk systems.
And this is the one that I think where I think impact is really going to be most broad.
Yeah, and this is where Centergy will be able to help. Not, of course, all of these now, but in human resources. If you're on this list, if your system is deemed high risk, you need to pass a conformity assessment. That's it. And that's essentially a self-declaration of conformity to the standards that are set for the EU. So you've got biometric identification, which I mentioned. And a lot of these are really kind of, they're public services, aren't they, Rob? Most of them are. So you've got...
this is the interesting thing. If you're reading through this list, you'll basically think all of these are public sector except one. All of these are largely public sector functions except one. And of course, that's the one that Kevin and I are talking about today.
Maybe two, actually. There's a second one I found. I'll come to that now.
Okay, yeah, possibly. It depends on how you interpret it, yeah.
You'll see. Maybe creditworthiness. So yeah, emergency first response services determine access to educational and vocational training. So vocational training, of course, that would fall into HR as well, I would argue. Human resources. So anything, well, this will affect your fundamental rights if you're being refused the job, if the computer says no, or to put you on a high potential list. Who creates that high potential list? It used to be humans in the past. It used to be kind of, by consensus. Now it'll just be an algorithm. And if that is the case, well, it needs to be fair. That's essentially what they're saying. It needs to be fair and monitored. Evaluate creditworthiness. So I think this is more private sector for fintech businesses.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah. And of course, AI and fintech is huge. Make law enforcement predictions. Fair enough. I think that should be high risk. I'm surprised it's not prohibited, because it's quite controversial and it doesn't work all that well.
Yeah.
And then to process, examine asylum and visa applications. So there's quite a bit on there. This is kind of like phase one. I'm sure more will be added over time.
And it needs to be said, and I'm sure we're going to excavate this a bit more, but if you fall within the high risk, if you fall within the prohibited category, you can't sell in the EU. If you fall within any of these high risk categories, you can, but you have to have the evaluation. And it's a fairly, I'd say that the vast majority of that 108 pages is about what you have to do if you're in this high risk category. So you basically fall under 108 pages or so of EU regulations.
So there's going to be a cost involved for these organizations. There's the businesses, the executives that decide on which technology they need to help them improve their products. They have an obligation now to insist that the tech that they're about to invest in, if it falls under high risk, that technology vendor has at least taken the steps to ensure that they'll be able to pass these conformity assessments. And an easy way to validate that is to just ask the tech vendor at the time, which ethical framework do you align your technology with? It's a good start at this point.
Yeah,
and can you prove it?
Exactly.
So we've got, you'll need to be registered on. So it's basically there's an EU database, and if you pass the conformity assessments, you get added to that. So that will be interesting, because I'm sure a lot of people will want to get a ticket. Want to be on that VIP list, which will be publicly available. This will be the master list of technology that's deemed fair. Transparency. There's new transparency requirements. So whenever we interact with AI systems, we need to be told that we are essentially.
And by the way, I believe, and you may correct me if I'm wrong in this, Kevin, I believe that is across all AI systems, not just the high risk category.
It's across the whole lot. Yeah.
So in other words, if nowadays, it's really funny. I had to unsubscribe from a magazine and was clearly dealing with the chat bot, which I tested very thoroughly to see if it would tell me it was a chat bot, and it wouldn't. It would refuse to tell me it was a chat bot when I asked it direct questions about it. That will end under this regulation, because you'll have to basically declare you are now speaking to a chat bot. You're not speaking to a human being, because otherwise it won't conform to the regulation.
Interesting to see how that pans out, but that should be easy. I don't know why. I have visions of you chasing a chatbot around the room now.
Yeah, it was very interesting. It was an interesting interaction. I think I've preserved it somewhere for writing about it later, but clearly it had been programmed to pretend that it was a human, even though it was very clear it was.
So if there are any breaches of these new conformity assessments, the public authorities are going to have the powers to be able to shut down the systems. So each national authority can shut down the system. It will then notify all other member states, and all of their national authorities for AI regulation will also be notified, and they will take corrective action themselves. So essentially, you breach, you're blacklisted, you're shut down, and you have huge fines.
And the regulations set up the expectation that there will be a national authority in all the EU countries. And I think it goes so far as to say kind of what size the office should be. I want to say it's a relatively small office, like 20 people. I've forgotten, but they're serious, because they're recommending they're mandating that there'll be an office, and they're recommending what its structure should be.
So there will be employment generated out of this. One of the positives, I suppose. Yeah, and then developers have to be in compliance. If you make false declarations, that can be easily verified, because each member state or national authority can request the data that you use to train the model, any data at all that was used for your technology, and all of the training manuals and anything essentially that you need to verify its compliance with the ethical standards that they set. So, and if you make false declarations, you're going to have a fine of 10 million, up to 10 million euro. That's just for a false declaration. If you are in breach, it could be 20 million euro. And if you create any blacklisting,
20 million, I believe, it's 20 million or a percentage of global profits, whichever is higher. And I think the percentage is, I can't remember what it is. I think it's 4% of global profits. But the 30,000 figure and the 20,000 figure are potentially minimum figures for very large organizations. So it's very clear what they have in their sights there.
I think like 4% of turnover or profit is always going to be smaller, unless these are absolutely huge organizations. Sure, and I can even imagine a large organization that invests in AI technology that will be a subsidiary. It won't be part of the main group.
Yeah, sure.
So I think the penalty here, the 20 million up to, by the way, depending on how severe that breach was, how severely an individual was affected, is really what it'll come down to. And then you've got blacklisted AI. So if you have blacklisted AI on the market, that's it, straight up, 30 million fine.
And remind me, Kevin, I know you know this. They have in the legislative, pretty draconian authority to shut down operations as well. If you're in breach somehow. I forget what the nature of the legislation there is, but they can basically shut down your operations throughout the EU.
And beyond. It could be the whole world. So any member states that any other country in the world that's part of this will have a national authority there, which will also be notified. and they will have the power to shut it down. And the process is you as the individual as a user identifies that this piece of tech has potentially affected somebody's fundamental rights. Well, they have to report that, and they have to take action as quick as possible. They'll need to take action themselves. The vendor it needs to be reported to the vendor, so that'll be their client that makes the report, and then if they try and remedy that as quick as possible and report it to the national authority within 15 days, with whatever steps they took to remedy the situation. So, and if it's not deemed satisfactory, they'll be shut down. If they think that it's going to happen again, it'll be shut down. That's what they're proposing. It's pretty serious. So that leads us on to the end of our presentation for today, our chat. We do have a book to give away. So let's see what questions that you have.
I've got to say there are already some pretty good questions in the Q&A, so it'll be interesting.
Thank you, Kevin and Robert. I'll pick up the questions and can answer them.
Well, I'd be glad to do them in, we could do them in order, or the compare can prompt us.
If you can read these questions and then you can respond, so I don't need to repeat them.
Okay, yeah, go for it. So the first question is about probability theory and the space of possibilities. And I have to ask this person, have you read my book? Because I talk specifically about this issue. And I do think one of the flaws in the probabilistic reasoning aspect of it, of any system that deals with uncertainty, is there's uncertainty beyond the representation. Everyone knows, for those of you who have a background in AI, everyone knows about the brittleness of AI in the rule-based AI space. It's the reason we had the AI winner back in the 70s and 80s. That problem also exists in the probabilistic space. It's just people aren't really talking about it yet. So, what's called ontological uncertainty is a real thing. And of course, that's going to be a problem. And that actually connects to what we were saying about the regulations today, because this conformity, under the proposed regulations, you must comply and maintain compliance. So effectively, there's going to be a need, if you make any significant changes to your software, to then assure compliance. Now, of course, with the way software works now in a kind of continuous integration, continuous development, DevOps, MLOps type mode, that really is going to be a difficult issue to sort out legally. I imagine what will happen is periodic compliance updates, because otherwise it's very difficult to comply with the regulations that basically say anytime you make a major change, you have to recertify. When people are making significant changes autonomously and all the time, it's going to be interesting to see how that works out. So I hope that answers that question. You want to make any comments there, Kevin?
No, it's interesting as to how many times they will need to recertify, especially if the tool itself is changing all of the time. It's learning as it's going, and you don't understand how it's changing and how its decision making is changing. Yeah.
And I'll move on to the next one if you like. This question about the soap dispenser. And the floor color, is the floor color affected? Probably, and I think it's the answer. I think it is this calibration of sensors problem. If you look at the brightness thing that I mentioned, effectively you can dial out contrast with brightness on a sensor, so it probably is related to the floor color. But nonetheless, it's a lack of engineering for the range of possibilities that could exist out there, and the testing probably was conducted in the way testing is usually is, without a thorough consideration of diversity.
I'll take the next one. How long do you think it may take to standardize ethical AI? Well, they've been trying to do it for a number of years now, and I think if you ask 100 people involved in ethical AI for a definition of AI, you get 100 different answers. So it's going to take a number of years.
Yeah.
But they're starting to harmonize. We look at the ethical standards for the US, the UK, and the EU, and they are kind of saying the same things. There's different pillars of trust that the EU will build their ethical framework on, and they all kind of fit into that. They might ask the questions in slightly different way, but they're starting to harmonize now. In 2 years' time, yeah.
Yeah, that's part of the work we've done, actually, is attempting to harmonize the standards that are out there. There's nothing that is discordant about the different things that are rising in different regions that we can see yet, but there are different perspectives, which I think is actually useful. I think the perspectives from various organizations can be very useful, but bringing it all into one frame and trying to make it compliant is challenging, and that's part of the work that Synergy is doing to set up what we're going to do with companies.
And of course, you mentioned to me earlier, Rob, about the difference between the US and the EU, and how they're both developing at a different rate, in different directions. And in the EU, it's about what you can't do, and in the US, it's I'm going to sue you if this makes the wrong decision.
Yeah. I mean, law evolves in the EU more through legislation than in the States, where it evolves through litigation. And all the human rights standards are arguably codified up to the constitutional level in the United States, although poorly enforced. Quite obviously, they do exist all the way up to the constitutional level. And in any of those instances, it provides a foundation for class action suits and the like. And I do expect that in the next few years, we'll be seeing class action lawsuits about human rights violations in the US based on AI algorithms. I think it's inevitable. You will see similar in the EU, but the EU are getting ahead of it through regulation. The US currently is unlikely to get ahead of it through regulation, except at the state level, as Kevin mentioned, New York are trying to do something about that. Some states will regulate, but then all of that will be driven up ultimately to higher levels, and we'll see what happens. But litigation is the way that will happen, just like with every other rights case in America since the 14th Amendment was passed. Everything is driven by litigation ultimately.
All right.
The next question I'll field if you want me to, Kevin.
Go ahead.
So in the world of clinical research, ethical approval is given by an independent committee that has a mix of experts and lay people to ensure that the ethical considerations are subject to wide perspective. Do you envision that similar committees panels will be needed for ethical review of AI tools? Absolutely. Absolutely. That's exactly. And it's interesting, I think under the EU regulation, the independent national bodies will operate in their own individual manners, but they'll all have to conform, of course, ultimately to the EU standard. But I expect that some of those national organizations will take the same approaches used in clinical research. It seems to me the appropriate metaphor, and I expect that's what will happen. I hope that's what will happen, as I think it's a trodden ground around ethics. But the issue of how the micro detail works still remains to be sorted, and I think that's one of those details. The way that the ecosystem is going to evolve for enforcement is interesting, and what Kevin and I are doing, I think, is trying to position ourselves so that we can play an important role in that ecosystem as it evolves.
And what do you think, Rob? Do you think the regulations will be reversed once all AI has improved and meets ethical standards?
Well, it's interesting to talk about what's going on in, let's just say within all right, so we have to target this broad definition of AI problem, but let's start off talking about machine learning and bias. What's going on, and there's very interesting and good work going on in AI, in ML around this, things like generative adversarial neural network scans to basically have an adversary challenge bias, or statistical oversampling, and there are a few other techniques that are out there that basically try to overcome bias in an AI way, to make the AI overcome the bias. I think that's fascinating and interesting work, but I'm a strong believer in the idea that all of these things are based on models of what we mean by bias, and those models ultimately are based on potentially brittle categories. And we get back to the first question we had about probability. Statistically, we can have categories where we basically say, or causal models that basically say this is the nature of bias. Those will never, in my mind, capture the full nature of what bias can be, right? I think that bias is a broader issue than this. So I ultimately think that, can you fix these problems in AI without having AGI is the real question. And my estimation will be, I think we're a long way from solving those kind of problems. Do I think technology will get better? I think the technology will get better, a lot better. Do I think it will be sufficient to make the proposed regulations from the EU go away? I think not. A lot about the proposed regulations from the EU are about human checking on systems, and they're about operational details rather than technical details of how systems are used and implemented and checked. If you look at the guidelines from various places like the Turing Institute, you'll find that there's a lot, or like the IEEE for automated systems, you find there's a lot in there about the ultimate responsibility of human beings. And I think that AI is very far from the point where people are going to say, okay, the AI is so good that we can back off those ideas. So I think it's very far in the future. I think the regulations are coming, and I don't think they'll be reversed in those aspects for quite a long time. That's just my opinion, though.
Interesting. Well, I suppose if you were to look at any product that you can sell in the EU, it needs to have a kite mark. It needs to meet various regulations, in order to be sold here. And just because the manufacturing processes are all clean and above board doesn't mean that they don't need to pass these basic tests.
Yeah, we still got inspectors, and I'll tell you a little anecdote here is people have tried to automate eBay. In effect, there's some services out there, particularly ones that donate to charities. I know one, I'm not going to mention its name, that basically what they do is you send in your goods, they evaluate their worth, and then they sell them. And when they sell them, they generate part of the profit to charity. Now, the one I'm thinking about grew very rapidly, so rapidly that their business model wouldn't work unless they got the scanning done automatically. And so they're effectively inspecting these goods for their quality and figuring out what pictures to post of them, etc. Those things do a very bad job even today. Quality inspection of complicated human goods is something you want somebody to put their hands on right now. And I think that, so I guess what I'm saying is this is inspection, even at the physical level, is not a solved problem. Inspection at the level of software and biases is even more distant, because a scuff versus a harm is a pretty big jump, right? Going from a scuffed shoe to a harm to a group or a person is a big jump, and I think we're pretty far from making that jump without having humans in the loop.
And the last question for you, Rob, to answer is, which of these questions wins the book?
Oh, wow, that's a good one. Let me look at them here. I tell you,
they're all excellent.
They're all excellent, but I have to go with Mark Ainsworth's question about clinical research, because I think that's really an important point, this idea of how humans are brought into the evaluation process. So that's my, as the book author, I'll make that decision. Congratulations, Mark. All the other questions were excellent as well.
Thank you to everyone. And Mark, connect with us on LinkedIn, and we'll arrange to have that book sent out to you.
Yeah. So you can connect with Kevin or Robert on LinkedIn, or you can send your details to I'll put an email ID. You can send it to me on this email ID, and I'll forward that to Kevin, and they'll act on it. So
excellent.
Well, Ram, thank you very much for inviting us to talk today. Really enjoyed it. I hope all the participants did too.
So I put this email ID in the chat box. Kevin, Mark, you can pick it up from there and send your address to me, and I'll pass it to Kevin and Robert.
Sounds great.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Kevin and Dr. Robert, for an excellent talk on ethics in AI. It was eye-opening. We had a similar talk about 2.5 years ago when the BCS president then talked on the same subject at University of West London. But then this is more a practical perspective that we have shared. And what I particularly liked was the change in the format. It was more of Q&A between Kevin and Dr. Which was just very interesting. It appeared as if Kevin is a common man or representing a corporate world, and Robert being the industry expert, sharing his thoughts and his experience. Wonderful.
Thank you.
So thank you very much to both of you, and thank you very much to all the attendees for attending this event and making it a success. Please connect with us on our LinkedIn page, and also look out for more events taking place. I can tell you about one particular event happening in June, which is from Facebook. It is a very interesting event. It is a repeat of what they had talked earlier on. So please sign up for that, and we look forward to seeing you again in the near future. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.